Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and welcome to another journal with me. So I had mentioned in the previous Alice Junk Journal videos that I was going to show you guys how to cover a book with fabric because we did not do that for the Alice Journal. We left it as it was. So for this tutorial, I'm just going to real quickly show you how we go about making this fabric covered book. I'll just give you a quick peek as to what it looks like when it's created. So let's go ahead and get started. So to create our hardback journal with a fabric cover, so that's something that I had talked about in my Alice Junk Journal tutorial. That particular book didn't need a fabric cover because I actually liked the cover that I was using for that book. But a lot of times when I create a junk journal, I'm using just a plain book cover like this one. This is a book that came from the dollar store. I have taken all the insides out and ripped out those cover pages and basically just, created this this flat working space, this template, so to speak. Now this one, I did accidentally cut through the binding here, which you can see, hopefully that shows up. It does go actually all the way through. So one of the things that we're going to do, and I'm kind of glad that this happened, is so that I can show you how you would fix that when you're deconstructing a book. So basically you're just going to take some duct tape, kind of just tack it down here. And the other good thing that this does, sorry, sidetracked, is to reinforce this spine. So this particular book is not very thick. It's not made really terribly well. And since we would be sewing signatures and attaching fabric and paper and heavy things to this binding, the duct tape also helps to create a kind of stability for it as well. It also gives it some more mass, some more structure. So basically I just take it and I go, it's roughly about there. I mean, we are going to cover this with fabric, so it does not need to be perfect. You just don't really want it to overhang too much. So we're going to cut that down there, and then I'm just going to pull this down here and kind of cut a length of that off. Now the one thing you do want to watch out for is not to get a ton of wrinkles in there, because those will show through your fabric if you get too many wrinkles in your binding. So that also covers where I've cut it. It also serves to reinforce the spine. Now generally, unless I'm working with a really thick, heavy-duty cover like I had with the Alice Journal, that was a really nice book to work with in terms of creating a junk journal. But generally when I'm working with these like cheap hardback books, like these dollar store ones, I generally do reinforce the spine. So again, just going to measure a length of duct tape here, and it doesn't have to be exact. Now this part is going to get covered up with our binding. I mean, I'm not going to actually bind this book because this is just a book that I'm using for example to show you how to create a fabric cover on a hardback book. So we won't actually be doing anything with this book. It's strictly for tutorial purposes, so I'm going to be using all of my excess stuff. So I do a strip there, and I do a strip on this side as well. You generally want to try to get things as flat as you can. I overcut this one, so I can just trim that off a little bit. But that gives us just a nice reinforced spine. Generally with a spine this particularly weak, I would have done this one double. And it also serves to cover up whatever print might be on the spine. Sometimes there's printing on the spine, and depending on how thick your fabric is or how light your fabric is, sometimes you can see through that. So putting the layer of duct tape on there really helps with that. If I were actually making this into a book and I was actually going to use this cover, I mean, which I guess I might at some point, but that's not my intention for today, I would do this double layer here on the front just like I did on the inside. So that's kind of how we would reinforce a spine on kind of a wobbly book. It gives it some more structure. It covers up anywhere we might have nicked the spine when we took the pages out. So the next thing that we're going to do is take our fabric that we're going to use, and like I said, this is just strictly for tutorial purposes, so I'm just using the excess fabric that I have laying around because I don't want to use anything that's earmarked for other projects. This is some Beauty and the Beast fabric that I have that I actually used to make my Chez Monet or Chez Monette tarot bag, and it was just, I bought it in bulk, so that's why I have a lot of it. Now, generally, I would recommend after you cut your fabric, you iron it. I'm not going to do that today just because I don't need to take the time to do that. And again, this is just for tutorial purposes. So we want to lay out our fabric and we want to flatten our book down as much as possible. Generally, I would cut this white edge off, which I will do at the after we get this cut to size. But we generally want to leave around about an inch on every side of our fabric. So, it doesn't have to be exact. An inch around. You can, of course, measure. Measuring is always a good thing. I'm gonna go ahead and trim this off. So like I said, I would, this has wrinkles in it, I would iron this. If you're actually making a book, which you will see, and I'll go ahead and do it without ironing it so you can see what it looks like, but you will get these wrinkles and creases in here if you don't iron it. So before you go to this point, you want to, of course, iron your fabric first. A lot of times you'll also maybe want to wash it first because it can shrink a little bit. So washing and ironing it is always good. I would wash it and iron it before you cut it to size, because if you cut it to size and then you wash it and iron it, it may shrink a little bit and then your fabric might not be quite big enough. So for this purposes, we're just going to go with it like it is. So now that we have the fabric cut to size with roughly an inch around every side. Again, this is just approximate, doesn't have to be exact. The next thing that we'll want to do is we'll want to get a bunch of these binder clips, and I like the little ones for this. So we will be using those in a minute. And we'll need, of course, fabric glue. I do really like Fabri-Tac for this particular process because this is kind of what it's designed for, and it works really well for this process. So before we start gluing anything down, the first thing that we want to do is dog ear our corners. We want to just trim them down because we don't need all that excess. As you can see, I'm not really measuring. I'm just trimming off that excess because it'll take away some of that bulk when we go to bend it around. And that will make more sense once we actually get to that point. So now we have kind of this nice little shape here with our 1 inch around and our cropped off corners. So the next thing that we're going to do is really just start gluing this fabric down. You don't really have to make sure that your book is one way or your fabric is another way, because at this point, it doesn't really matter whether the book is up or down. You're going to cover it all anyway. So generally what I do is I start at one corner and I run a line of glue across the top, all the way across here, and then I run a bead of glue along that inside seam just to ensure that we will get some glue in there. And then I kind of just do a little squiggle here, and we'll tack down the rest of it when we get to that point. So now what we're going to do is we're going to start folding this over and pulling it tight. And again, like I mentioned, if you watch the Alice tutorial, using Fabri-Tac, if you push too hard, your glue is going to seep through your fabric. So we don't want to push too hard. We just kind of want to smush that down a little bit. Okay. And we're going to kind of try to get it in those seams pretty good. And we're going to use our binder clips to just very carefully clip it in place to hold it because we are going to be flipping it around and pulling on it from the other side. So I always do opposite sides, and this helps ensure that you're getting that tight binding. So we're basically going to repeat the process here. You don't want to get too terribly much glue in this inner seam here because it will seep through if you get too much going there. And now we're going to flatten our book out. So we always make sure our book is as flat as we can get it. And then we're going to start pulling that taunt. As you can see, I'm kind of pulling and rolling it towards me, and that's going to ensure that it gets that nice tight fit. And again, not pushing too hard on the fabric because I can already feel where that Fabri-Tac is coming through. On the insides here, it doesn't matter a whole lot, but you don't want it seeping through, you know, your front or where you actually will be able to see it. So now we have both of those sides done. The Fabri-Tac does dry fairly quickly, but you could leave this and let it sit for a few just to make sure that it's good and adhered before you start yanking on it the other way. Because I'm not actually making this a real book, I'm just going to go ahead and move forward with this process. Now, with one of the reasons why you might want to sit and let it dry is because you don't want these binder clips in the way when you try to pull this one, because if you can see here, I'm not flat against my board, so I'm not going to get a really tight seal because I've got that give here. So we really don't want these binder clips in the way. So for right now, I'm going to take them off, which is generally why I would leave this and let this side, these two sides kind of dry a little bit before I would go on to this part. So when we get to these last two sides, then we have to contend with our corners here. So there's a couple of different ways that you can do this. You know, you can do a fold and then a fold again, and that gives you a really nice tight seam, which tends to be how I do it. Some people clip these even closer, so they will clip it literally to the corner, and then it just kind of leaves, once you fold it over, it leaves just a minute little gap. You can also just fold this corner in and fold it flat here and just work it through until it comes down to be flush here. You can also fold it like that as well. And then you can take your scissors and clip again just to make sure that you're not having any of that overhang. So generally what I do is I run a little bit of glue on this inside here and right here where my fabric is folding over itself, and I'll do that on both sides. And then what we're gonna do is clip this just a little bit tighter. So now you can see that I've got a nice fold there, but I've not overrun. And this part that's kind of, I don't even know if it'll show up because it's the same color on the same color, but it's not straight. That's okay, because that's gonna get covered up with our inside papers. So I'm gonna clip that one, and I'm gonna look and see here, this one is just a little overlaid. So I'm gonna clip that down there just so that it's the same. And really this is kind of just trial and error. So before you actually start on a book that you want to work with, I would recommend practicing on like a cheap dollar store book with some cheap fabric that you really don't care about, and do a couple practice runs so that you can kind of get the hang of how this process goes and what might work best for you, because everybody likes to do it a little bit differently. And when you haven't done it before, it can be a little bit tricky to figure it out. So I really recommend practicing first. And I did practice on a couple of different books first. Those children's books from the dollar stores and stuff, those are great because they also, they're small, they don't take up a lot of glue or fabric or materials, and you can practice with them. So those are really great too. So basically I'm just going to repeat the process that I did before. And we're gonna pull this down, and I am pulling it towards me because I want to get that as tight as possible. I will go back and add more glue so that this is not flopping up like this. But for right now, we're going to roll with it this way, and I am gonna go ahead and stick binder clips on these two sides here where my corners are, just to keep them down, and I'm gonna throw one there. So now I'm gonna take these clips off because I don't want them in the way, and we're just going to repeat the process. And then we're going to set this aside and let that glue dry really well before you move on to the next part. So while this is kind of sitting here drying, like I said, I would recommend waiting till it's good and dry, but we can go ahead and start cutting our cover papers to size. Now, before we add any papers to this, what we need to decide is if we want a ribbon closure. So if you want a ribbon closure, now is the time to go ahead and do that. So I'm going to take a length of ribbon, just like I did in my Alice journal, and I'm gonna go approximately 3 times the length of my book, which is going to be all of this ribbon. You could also do approximately 2 times the length of the book, and that, for the most part, should give you enough. I just like to do 3 just to be sure. I'd rather have to cut some off and have it be too long than to have it not be long enough and to not actually work as a closure, because once you glue this in, you can't really get it back out. It's pretty much in there. So we're gonna fold it. Once we have it cut to size, we're gonna fold it in half, and then we are going to find the middle of our book. Now, there have been many a times that I forgot to put my ribbon closure in before adding my cover papers, and you can fix it. It is possible. You just have to very carefully peel up your cover papers. Pretty much guarantee it's going to ruin your cover papers, but you should be able to salvage your fabric cover. So you'll just have to get a new piece of paper to do your cover with, and you can pull it up and then you can put your ribbon back in, but it's just really not the easiest way to go about it. So it's best to just kind of plan ahead and decide what you're going to do and do them, you know, in the proper orders. So we've got this folded in half, and I'm going to put it roughly in the book. You can, of course, measure, but you know me, I don't really do that. So I'm just going to start with some glue in the middle here, and I'm going to go the middle of my book, top to bottom and side to side. And then I'm going to fold this over and just kind of press that down. It's not real terribly important to watch out for seepage, because you're going to cover this up anyway. This binder clip is going to be in my way. So we kind of tack that down in the middle there, and then we basically just run a bead of glue. I just kind of do a squiggly line that is hopefully in the same spot. And at this point, I forgot to mention, we want to glue this side down. So any excess you've got hanging out over here, you can go ahead and glue down. Again, this is going to get covered with paper, so it just kind of helps you to keep things from bunching up on you is really all the purpose is. So we run the glue clear to the edge over that fabric, and I go about, I go almost to the edge, like really close to it. I don't want the glue to seep onto the front of my cover, but I want my ribbon to be glued down pretty well because it's going to take a lot of wear and tear. So I'm just going to press this down. And again, I'm getting glue seeping through the ribbon, but that's okay because this is going to be under my closure. So we're going to go and glue this excess fabric down just so it's not in our way. So we don't want to create any extra bulk in our book. And it would have been smart for me to glue these down first before I did that, but basically you're just going to run a line of glue under the fabric, not on top of it, because that doesn't do any good, like I just did. So then we basically repeat the process over here and, you know, try to keep things as straight as possible. So there we have that glued down. And again, ultimately you want to sit and let this dry really well before you move on to the next part. So once we have our ribbon down and our fabric adhered, basically what we want to do is create our cover pages. Now, if you're doing a fabric binding like I did with the Alice Junk Journal, whereas your fabric is going to overlay part of your papers. So just to see here, just for a reminder, so we have our fabric overlaying our paper here, our cover pages. And that is totally just if you want that particular look. If you don't want that particular look and you want your fabric to be under your pages, you would of course glue your signature in first and then glue your cover page on top of it. But I like this little bit of fabric. I think it adds texture. It gives some more layer and definition to the book, and I just think it looks really pretty. So that's how I do it. But if you didn't like that fabric seam showing here, you could glue your book block in and then lay your cover page over the top of this binding. So if you were doing that, you would basically just hold off on the rest of this cover until you had all of your inserts done, and then you would come back and finish up with where we're going to go from here. So I just wanted to point that one out to you, just in case, because everybody likes to do it a little bit differently. So at this point, what we're going to do is, and I'm gonna have to just move these binder clips out of the way and hope that everything is glued down enough that it's going to stay for our purposes. So with my whole point to that being, if you're going to have the fabric overlay your pages, your cover pages do not need to go all the way to this edge. And in fact, it's better if it doesn't, because fabric bends a lot better than paper does. Paper, after a while of bending and bending and bending, will eventually start to kind of give, and it does have the tendency to tear. So another kind of plus for doing the fabric binding over the top of your paper is that it just adds that stability. And like I said, fabric will take a bend for a lot longer. It's a lot more forgiving and a lot more sturdy than paper is. So if you're doing the fabric binding over the top, you basically just want to get, like, you know, fairly close to your edge, but you don't want to hit your bend here, your spine. So ours is bending right about there. So I would probably just go right about to about here. We want to use the black. Well, let's use the colored side. That shows up a little bit better anyway. It doesn't really matter because, again, we're just doing this for tutorial purposes. So at this point, basically what I'm going to do is I want to get my cover pages pretty close to the end of my book. I'm going to leave it, I think it's like approximately 1 centimeter. You know me, I wing it. So I'm going to put it right about where I want it. And then I'm going to go, I want it to sit right about here because my fabric, you know, theoretically is going to cover into my binding here, or over my paper there. So I'm going to say that's about where I want it. And I will do measurements after I figure that out, because I do need to cut 2 pages about the same size. So I want it to go right about here. And you can see I've left about the same amount there. And I'm just going to measure right about here. And there's my measurements. Now, we're going to move this away. So this is, basically we need to make 2, what is this? Use my board. I always forget to use my board. So it is, this one is roughly 5.5 by 9. So which means this is probably a 6x9 book. So you could also take your ruler and measure and say, I want to go right about here. So accounting, if you go to the edge of your ruler, you can say that's about 1/2 centimeter or so. So 5.5 puts me right about here. And again, leaving a little bit of space on either side, 9 inches puts me about there. So, you know, however it works, it makes sense for you, however you want to go about it. My first cut is going to be there, so I'm going to make another cut here. And I'm just kind of going down and giving myself a couple of marks. And you can see that using this one sheet of 12x12 scrapbook paper, I can get both sides of my cover. So that's really great, especially if you want, you know, to have the same pattern. You could also use 2 different sheets and get 2 different patterns on either side. That totally works either way. So I always want to use my straight side. I think I've said this a million times before. I always want to use the straightest side to make my first, to line up with, so that I am making sure that I'm getting a nice clean cut every time. So now that we have both of our sides cut, and this particular paper gave me, you know, because it had a gradient on it, I've got different colors on different sides. It's kind of cool. I think I'm going to switch them around. Does it really matter? Nope, but just cause. So now what we basically want to do is double check that we cut these correctly and that everything's lining up the way we want it to. Now here I am actually pressing pretty hard because it's not gonna, the glue's not gonna seep through this paper, and I wanna make sure that it is pressed down there really well. Also, if you had a book that had rounded corners and you know you went ahead and rounded the corners, you could round the corners of your papers too, but this book has square corners, so I'm keeping them square. So I'm gonna make sure to press those corners down really well and press down where my ribbon closure is. And then we do the other side. And there we have our fabric covered book. So now you can see it's upside down, doesn't really matter. It would have mattered, I should have mentioned that, if this paper had a particular pattern or an image on it. You would of course want to make sure that your book is upright, or your fabric is upright, if it also has a certain pattern or direction to it. And then your papers, you know, make sure that those are upright too. Because this is not a patterned paper, it doesn't really matter. I can go either way with it. And it works just as well either way. So now we have our book covered in fabric with our inside covers and our ribbon closure. So this is pretty much the whole process. Now at this point, if you were of course making a book, you know, you can see that if you had that fabric, the fabric spine for your signatures like we did in the Alice Junk Journal, you know, you could take, of course this would not work, but if you had your signature sewn to your fabric, you could see that you would lay your fabric binding over the top of this. Your signatures would of course be sewn into the middle. In a small book like this, you'd probably only do 1, maybe 2 at most. And then you would glue this down over the top of your cover like we did with the Alice Journal. So then that covers up all of this, you know, kind of ugly stuff, all the seams that you got going in there. If you were doing, you know, a different type of spine, you can still do this if you wanted to do, glue your fabric in and you wanted to do a hard spine, just a free-floating spine of its own. You could also do that as well. You could glue this fabric over the top, you know, and do your spine glued directly to this rather than having the fabric and the spine all in one like we did with the Alice Journal. That is totally an option as well. You could do a really thick one. You know, it doesn't have to be If I kind of fold this in, it doesn't have to be thin. It could be a really thick one. And you could have lots of fabric overlaying and just have a little bit of paper here. Or you could also do, you know, fabric instead of paper. Fabric is a little bit harder to get these nice straight edges with. It's not impossible. It's not impossible, but it is a bit harder. So I tend to use paper on the inside, fabric on the outside, and then I have my fabric spine, you know, right there. So that is basically the whole process of covering a hardback book with fabric. You could also do, you know, some decoration as well, add some bits of, you know, lace or additional fabric. But the big thing is just really to make sure that you get that fabric covered on there, you get it on there tight. And if you're going to do a ribbon closure, it's important to do your ribbon closure before you put your cover pages, your cover papers on the inside. So that is pretty much that whole process. So thank you so much for joining me for this tutorial of creating a fabric cover on your hardback books. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have any questions, please let me know in the comments below. I look forward to seeing you again soon for more creative tarot for an inspired life.